So we're about midway through the regular season, and I deem it necessary to take a step back and look at the transaction that occurred during the offseason between the New York Knicks and the Minnesota Timberwolves. A trade that was not only very interesting in the moment, and certainly something that people were going to talk about as the season progressed, but I believe a transaction that will be franchise defining for both organizations for several different reasons. So a little bit of a backstory for those who may not be aware of what I'm talking about. Last year, there were a lot of teams in the NBA that exceeded expectations that had really exciting storylines, one of which was in the Eastern Conference with the New York Knicks, and the other was in the Western Conference with the Minnesota Timberwolves. Both teams exceeded expectations by fairly wide margins, in my opinion. First, you have the Knicks as they finished the season with 50 games in the win column, which is the first time that this franchise has been able to do so since 2013. The reason why they were able to do this is because they were top 10 in both offense and defense, very well-rounded roster, and more importantly, they built an identity that they were able to hang their hat off on. And the leader of this new identity, of course, is Jalen Brunson, and the gamble that they took out on him a couple of years ago really started to pan out and was clearly materializing in front of us all last season as Jalen Brunson took the next step into stardom. And then, of course, the addition of OG Anunoby, the improvement of players such as Josh Hart, DiVincenzo, and Hartenstein really made this a well-rounded organization that was able to make it into the second round, compete against the Indiana Pacers team that also exceeded expectations as well. And even though they were not able to make it beyond the second round, a huge reason for this was just because of injuries. They really was pushing the limit with a lot of those players out there being coached by Thibodeau. But the much bigger picture with everything that was going out there in the Big Apple is that they were able to accomplish all of this, see this level of success, despite the fact that Julius Randle was sidelined for a good portion of it last season. It was unfortunate, but it really was revealing on the value of who Julius Randle was going into the offseason, which really begged the question on what they were going to do with him, especially because this is a team that had a lot of contract questions heading into the offseason as well. But before we get too ahead of ourselves, we pivot out to Minnesota and a very similar success story as well. Minnesota finished the season with 56 wins, led by their young star in Anthony Edwards, and an all-time great defensive unit being anchored by Rudy Gobert. All of this translated to a deep postseason run all the way to the conference finals, where you could easily argue that this is the most success that the franchise had ever seen since 2004. And I'm actually going to go out on a limb and say that that was indeed the best season in franchise history, because there was a very real moment throughout that postseason run where many people were convincing themselves, including myself, that this team could not only make it to the finals, but could compete with the Boston Celtics and potentially even upset them as well. That's how dominant the Timberwolves looked throughout that postseason run. But unfortunately, wasn't able to make it to the final stage, lost to the Dallas Mavericks in the conference finals, but there were still a lot of great moments throughout that postseason run, in particular, how impactful Karl Anthony Towns was. Up until that moment, Towns was a bit of an afterthought in the NBA community, but had a really great season last year, complimenting Rudy Gobert and Jaden McDaniels in the front court, while also being that secondary offensive option alongside Anthony Edwards, giving them the 1-2 punch that this team desperately needed throughout several games throughout this run. Unfortunately, didn't look the greatest in the conference finals, but the value of Karl Anthony Towns definitely could not have been understated, but it was going to be put into question during the offseason with the amount of money that he was making in this new CBA that was going to be very restricting, to the point where the Timberwolves were not going to be able to make any more additions to this roster if they decided to go down this path of keeping him on the team. Which then brings us to the offseason where the Knicks and Wolves got together, made a trade, sent Julius Randle and Dante to the Wolves, and in return, Minnesota sent over Karl Anthony Towns to the New York Knicks. Now, this trade, because of the level of value that Towns brought to that team, of course, raised a lot of eyebrows as people were kind of questioning what was going on. But like I said before, because of the new rules set in place under this new CBA, it was really leaving Minnesota in a bit of a predicament, a bit of a pickle, if you will. And of course, people had their opinions and their takes on this transaction and what exactly it was going to mean for both franchises. And we are midway through the regular season. I'm gonna tell you one thing for sure and two things for certain. Bro, New York came out like a bandit, like a bandit when it comes to this transaction. And I have to say, I feel sorry for Minnesota fans because it sucks, bro. Y'all built something very special, and it seems as if like it has just been wasted away because of a rule that no one really had control of whatsoever, and really put you in a situation that you could not fix at all. You could not prevent what was going to happen. Now, why exactly am I this animated about it? Well, again, let's be positive, because we have talked about the negatives, and I have to do a better job with this. When it comes to Karl Anthony Towns this year for the New York Knicks, I have not done my due diligence on the level of impact that he's had on that franchise. So far this season, the New York Knicks have a record of 26-15. They are top 2 in the offensive rating, one of the best offenses not only this season, but of all time. And their defense isn't as bad as many people thought it was going to be, ranking right above top 20 status and giving them a net rating of nearly 7. So even though, yes, their defense defense has been bad, their offense is so great and playing at such a historic level that they're still beating teams by a fairly comfortable margin. And the huge reason for this is because of Towns. Big Purr. He's having a career year. He is dominating. He's getting back in his bag. So far this season, Cat is averaging 25 points, 14 rebounds, 3 assists, shooting 55% from the field, and a whopping 45% from behind the arc. Comparing these numbers to what he was doing last season, there is an improvement in every single statistical category. Points, rebounds, assists, accuracy across the board. It's actually very, very impressive. And I just don't think that Towns is getting enough credit from going from who he was last year to where we are today. And it's giving a lot of people a reminder of why Towns was a #1 overall pick back in 2015. It's reminding people that Towns was averaging 25 points in his sophomore season. It is reminding people that Towns really is one of those guys. He's really one of them. And pairing him alongside someone like Brunson really has continued to add to his game. The pick and pop game that has happened between him and Brunson has been immaculate. His ability to space out the floor at a historic pace. And I'm not just saying that as a big, shooting 45% with the long ball for any player in NBA history is crazy, especially on 5 threes a game. Very, very impressive. And his rebounding numbers, I mean, nearly 14 a game. 14 a game? For most of the season, he's been leading the NBA in rebounds. And defensively, it's still not great. It's not amazing, but it's nowhere near as bad as I think many people like myself thought it was going to be. Mitchell Robinson still needs to hurry up and come back because we're kind of delaying that return a little bit more. But so far this season, Towns has been the difference maker for this team in several games, several incidences, and several moments when they needed him the most. And the on-off numbers point to this very clearly. When Towns is on the floor, the Knicks have an offensive rating of 121, but when he's off the floor, it drops all the way to 111, leaving them with a net rating of nearly 10 when he's on the floor, and they're barely breaking even when he's off the floor. That's how impactful Towns has been for this New York Knicks team. And all of these numbers and impact resulted in Towns receiving Player of the Month in December when he averaged 23 points, nearly 15 rebounds, and 3 assists, but more importantly, was a pivotal piece of leading the New York Knicks to a 12-1 record out in December. And possibly a more important and even bigger reason why it is so impactful that Towns is able to produce at this level is because it has now allowed the Knicks to weather the storm during stretches from certain other players not being able to reach expectations, in particular Mikal Bridges, who to start the season, he hasn't been that greatest, in particular with his 3-point shooting. It's gotten better as the year progressed, but it's still been up and down. So far this season, he's only making 34% of his shots from behind the arc, so that's not that great. And if he was a slightly better 3-point shooter like he was in years prior, he would be a 20-point per game scorer, which would make an already great offense even better. So that certainly isn't helping him out. But Towns has been able to pick up a lot of slack where certain players have dropped it off, and I think that's been perfect for what this team certainly needs. Now, on the other side of the tracks, we got the Minnesota Timberwolves, and I've talked about this early on this season, so I'm not going to go into too many deep details, but as we all know, it's just not hitting right. Pause. So far this year, the Minnesota Timberwolves have a record of 21-18, just a couple of games above 500. Defensively, there has been a slight regression. Right now, they only have a defensive rating of 111, which is top 6 in the NBA. But offensively is where we see the biggest concern, as the Wolves only have an offensive rating of 112, which put them into bottom 10 standing. And in all honesty, some of this could have been expected before the season began, because if you go back and look at the on-off numbers when it comes to Towns out in Minnesota, this team was just 2 different units, night and day, offensively, when Towns was on the floor versus when he was off the floor, which makes a lot of sense because this is a front court that features Jaden McDaniels, who isn't that great of a 3-point shooter, and Rudy Gobert, who really didn't give you much of anything on the offensive side of the floor. And so Minnesota desperately needed someone like Towns to provide that scoring punch and that floor spacing that is really hard to find at that position and at that size. And Randall just has not been able to provide this, and the fit has been extremely awkward. So far this season, across the board, the sheer volume from Randall has been down in contrast to what we saw last season. And even though there is a slight improvement in 3-point accuracy in contrast to last year, the truth of the matter is teams just don't defend Julius Randle at the 3-point line at all. And so when you're talking about a team that has a front court of Julius Randle, Jaden McDaniels, Rudy Gobert, and hell, at this point, depending on who's on the wing with Anthony Edwards, it could be another non-3-point shooter depending on the night. It now has forced a team that was already struggling on that side of the floor to not only look worse, but also just make it overall more difficult for someone like Anthony Edwards to get off, which is not not only resulted in Ant attempting more threes than he's ever attempted at any point in his career, which again, we talked about this before. He's forced to shoot more threes because the floor is shrunk, because there's not as much offensive firepower, and in particular, because there's not as much floor spacing out there surrounding him like it was last year with Towns. But now, because he actually is knocking out his threes at a ridiculous rate, teams are now just double teaming him because they're starting to realize, well, I mean, he's making his threes and there still isn't another three-point shooter out here, so we might as well just leave these players butt booty naked open and just come over, shift, send help, and make him a passer, which now Anthony Edwards has come out and voices frustrations on how teams are starting to defend him. Now, on one hand, you could easily argue that Anthony Edwards should look at this with some level of pride and gravitas, because opposing teams look at him in such high prestige that they have to just double team him over and over and over again to get the ball out of his hands. And though that may be true, it's still just undeniable. Part of the reason why they also do this is because Towns isn't on the team anymore. Like, they have Randall. So they're just going to shift over, double team, send help, shift, and just dig at him when he is attacking the basket. And that sucks. Like, that just overall sucks. And then add on top of the fact that the other addition in Dante DiVincenzo, he's shooting worse than he was last season from behind the arc. Naz Reid has started to see a slip for his three-point percentage. To be fair to Naz, recently he's turned around a little bit. The last 15 games, he's shooting around 40% from behind the arc, so we'll give him a little bit more time. But then there's also a regression from Jaden McDaniels and Mike Conley, so much so that Mike Conley is now being placed on the bench, which I personally believe should have happened early in the season. I understand that Mike Conley, table setter, old school guard, passer, playmaker, so you needed him to kind of set up everything, and that's something that you didn't get out of Anthony Edwards early on this season, but he's 37, dog. And then when it comes to Jaden, offensively, it's always been spotty and questionable, but it's the defensive side of the floor that is really scaring me. Bro, Jaden used to be able to stand in front of players really, really well. I've just seen him get blown by way too often for my liking, and also his ability to kind of navigate screens was also a problem last year in the postseason, and it seems like it's still a problem and somehow gotten even worse, especially during that Dallas Mavericks series. From that Mavericks series to where we are now, Jaden's ability to just defend on ball and navigate screens has gotten significantly worse. That's kind of concerning. But so you went from arguably best season in franchise history with a front court that was able to solve the problem that is out in Denver with Jokic, while also presenting another problem that most teams in the NBA cannot compete with an ascending star in Anthony Edwards. And depending on how high you are on Ant, you still are probably under the assumption that he's going to be in top 5 status sometime in the near future, while also having a lot of other complementary pieces that worked out really well in your favor. To now, I just don't even know the future of what this team looks like. Again, I understand that there was going to be a lot of questions due to the financial implications of Karl Anthony Towns and his contract, but I do believe, and this was always the biggest fear, that you leveraging your inability to be able to add any more pieces to this roster because of this new CBA for some type of quick relief financially was probably going to hurt you in the long term, because now it's just very, very clear that Towns and what he provided to this team is arguably irreplaceable at this point, because what he's doing out there in New York is kind of crazy. And it does beg the question, what exactly is next for Minnesota? And to be fair and transparent, because there is this large elephant in the room when it comes to discussing the New York Knicks, and that's the amount of minutes that are being played out there. And that's something that we probably already knew before the season began, because Thibodeau, boy, he liked to run up the minutes. He liked to run it up. You know what I'm saying? You're going to be out there on the floor 35, 36, 38, 44 minutes a night. I don't think people thought it was going to be this bad, to the point where the Knicks effectively just play like a 7-man rotation. The fact that they're now paying OG Anunoby and Towns, the amount of money that they're paying does cut into their ability to add as many rotational players on this roster as possible. So yeah, this is going to be a fairly shallow team in terms of personnel and talent, because now the Knicks don't have that much flexibility to add to this team because of Towns and the contract that he's getting paid. But I will say, probably would rather go in that direction than what we're seeing out in Minnesota right now. Because as much as it may hurt some of those owners out there in Minnesota, I promise you, with what Towns is producing right now, not only did you clearly, and I do mean clearly, lost this trade, but like I said earlier in this video, this transaction will go down as a franchise-defining move. But hey, those are my thoughts. Shout out to the Knicks, shout out to Karl Anthony Towns, and hopefully sometime soon we can see more of this from Anthony Edwards, because the brother just getting double teamed every single night. The floor is shrinking on him, and it sucks. But let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. And until next time, I'll see you all later. Peace.